Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I join my colleagues that went before me in extending 44th Republic Day greetings to the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. In normal times, last night, Roxborough would have been the place to be. But we are now adjusting to the new normal, and it is with hope that all of my colleagues and the listening public continue to remain safe as we battle this COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I start my contribution this afternoon by first commending the Secretary and the Assistant Secretary at the Division of Education, Innovation and Energy, the administrator, all the school supervisors, the principals, the teachers for rising to the occasion in the first instance and putting the necessary measures in place to ensure that the education, the dreams, and the aspirations of our children, our students on the island of Tobago remain a top priority. They are laying the groundwork, they are putting the necessary measures in place to ensure that learning at all levels, as was carefully articulated by both the Assistant Secretary and the Secretary, though the traditional method of teaching and delivery is disrupted, other innovative measures and options are in place. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I know we would all admit this afternoon that there is no one-size-fits-all mechanism that can be applied to treating with this COVID-19 pandemic, be it economical, be it social, be it educational. The situation remains fluid. We are seeing, even here in Trinidad and Tobago, the changes in the number of cases daily. There is new information on the virus, and there is no vaccine, no time period for a vaccine even. In Trinidad and Tobago, again, we are in our second wave. I am sure as far back as June, we did not expect that we would be here. However, we are here, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, and we must and will do what is necessary. For the most part, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, this COVID-19 conversation has predominantly occupied or been the subject matter of discussion since the year began. COVID-19 has impacted every community, every society, every home, every country around the world, and that's why we call it a global pandemic. And although in the first instance, it is deemed a physical health crisis, there has been undue stress on the economy, the environment, our social functioning, our family functioning, the education system, and in many cases, psychological functioning as persons are trying and continuing to cope with this new normal. The implications of this virus, it has drastically disassembled the educational map across the globe. It is not unique to our island and its traditional mode of delivery. In relation to the educational systems, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, just some research that I came across. The United Nations reported that the closure of schools and other learning spaces has impacted 94% of the schools' population across the world and up to 99% in low and middle class income countries. And so it is evident, as I said, that this implication is worldwide. It has forced schools to close, and some schools will remain closed for an extended period of time. This rapid shift, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, to virtual delivery can and will be stressful for teachers, for parents, and of course students. And there is no question about that. As a matter of fact, generally working from home can be difficult and it presents its own challenges. We have seen feedback from parents and teachers over the last 2 weeks about how mentally draining they are, this is the new operation is. And especially if you are teaching a class, that you must supervise and then supervise your own children, with classes. And so Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, as the Assistant Secretary of Health, and having been trained in counseling and mental health and so on, I understand and empathize with the students, with the parents and the teachers, because I understand the trauma, the social and psychological effects that would be experienced and are being experienced at this time. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, as the pandemic continues across the country, we know there would be a cause for concern. There is unwavering fear and stress are in great magnitude. Again, we are reacting to a situation as it continues to unfold, and parents and guardians may start to feel overwhelmed and stressed as they are primarily dealing with children's learning, which may in turn be challenging as much as it is for teachers. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, given the magnificent changes that are before us, there is now a greater opportunity for collaboration or more collaboration with both parents and teachers. There is now an opportunity to work hand in hand to ensure that the well-being of the students and your children are being addressed, because despite the challenges that lies ahead, parents and teachers must be willing to make these sacrifices. And that is the point that I want to make. It is a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice for all of us as leaders. It is a sacrifice for you, the teachers, and it is also a sacrifice for the parents. The measures such as school closures have disrupted children's routine and social support. This is an added stressor on parents, on the guardians, or the caregivers who are managing the work and childcare options throughout the day. And having mentioned before the psychological effects from this pandemic, it means that psychosocial support is critical. And many more teachers may and will need psychosocial support themselves if they are to meet the needs of parents in adapting, and if they are also to meet the needs of their students. So at the Division of Education, Innovation and Energy, through their social support unit, and even at our division, the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development, we will ensure that the necessary support measures are in place should it be required by teachers at any time. Because without this and the continued strain, we know that the teachers, this can lead to burnout, resulting in teachers and educators being unable to deliver, which will further undermine what we are trying to achieve as an island and what we are trying to achieve as a country. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I know there are some teachers who are adapting better than others. And we should be at a place now where we are not afraid to reach out to our colleagues for guidance on any matter that is overwhelming. Because in this time, we are saying we need to be each other's keeper. If you are in the same school, we are asking you to check on your colleague who may be teaching in another class, just to see how the week went. We know that many times these gestures, they go a long way in calming the nerves of other teachers who may just be on the peak of exploding. And while you are lending the support, teachers, to your colleagues and to the parents and to the students themselves, most importantly, we want you to practice self-care. Bouts of self-care would be critical at this time to ensure that you remain functioning, to ensure that you are able to adapt. You need to find time to recharge, find time to re-energize, to ensure that you are not burnt out. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, just around the 1st of September, I provided devices to 6 students from my village primary school that I attended. And yes, I posted it on Facebook. And it seems that once you are in the majority and something is done and you post it on Facebook, it's for political expediency. So yes, it was posted on Facebook. But the point I want to make, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, what that did, it was able to inspire other persons, because I want to say something today. 3 persons reached out to me after they saw that post and it was in the news and so on. And they donated 3 additional devices. I was able to purchase 2 more. And so I was able to give an additional 5. In addition to the 5 that I gave before. So all who may be interested in politics and think that everything is about politics, let us look at the bigger picture. We need all hands on deck at this time. And Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I did not just give the devices and leave it there. I ensured someone was available to help the parents and the students set up the devices if they needed that assistance. I have been checking in on both the parents and the students to ensure that they are coping. And these are not people that I know personally, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, but a simple phone call to find out how Jane enjoyed school today. How is Jane adapting? Did she understand the information, etc.? These simple gestures aid in calming and lending the necessary support, the same support that the motion is speaking about, because it seems like the members of the minority, they only looked at certain aspects of the motion. But this same support that we are lending is what this motion is calling on all of us to do as leaders and as people on the island of Tobago. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, as we all know, to most of the parents especially, this is new territory, and some of them would take a very long time, and they would take a while to get the hang of it. So if we all play some small role, as I said, being your brother's keeper, it goes a long way. We have situations right here in Tobago where some parents just cannot afford a device for a child. What role are you willing to play? What are you doing? We know that the Division of Education announced that they are going to be providing devices for students. But what are you doing in the meantime? We need to all play our part. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, support is needed in helping parents to adjust their expectations. And that is the expectations of their child, because there are some children who may have been, children or students, who may have been performing very well in the traditional face-to-face delivery method, but they may have fallen back in this new normal. So we want parents to also understand, again, this is new territory, and we want the teachers as well to provide the necessary guidance and just work with the students. We are asking for parent, guardian groups. Forums would be very critical. Parent, teachers groups, parents and parent groups, teachers and teachers groups. These would be very critical to ensure that the necessary support is received and given that is required throughout this period. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, the role of parent has now expanded to educator, and it is not to say that some parents may not have been actively involved in their students' lives or their children's educational pursuits. Parents and guardians, they are now expected to play even a greater role to support their children's educational dreams. So we have parents who are now balancing remote learning, they are balancing family functioning, and they would need the support. The expectation to teach children may leave many parents feeling anxious, because they may be wondering, am I doing it right? Am I doing the best that I can? And teachers and principals and educators should provide these parents with as many detail as possible and learning outcomes, and we do believe that will go a very long way. Now, I just want to speak briefly on employers. And the minority leader mentioned in his contribution about public officers should stay home from work and who should stay home from work. But Mr. Deputy Presiding Officers, as leaders of this island and of this country, we have to ensure that as we are managing one situation, we are not disrupting the other. Because we would say all public servants stay home, but when the month comes, nobody could get their salaries. So if we have to manage, and employers must determine if their current workplace policies effectively support families. We are asking for flexible work arrangements to be established as the needs of working parents may vary. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, employers at work are well aware that school is out, daycares and all the child centers are closed. So we are asking to provide support to the parents and to the teachers as well by implementing flexible working hours, work from home policies as best as possible. So it gives them the opportunity in the first instance to be there with the children, assisting them with the transition and also with the learning materials that will be distributed, whether virtually or hard copy from the schools. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, children, even as they as well, are required to stay home and pursue schooling through online platforms. The supervision of these children is of great importance. This situation has placed a great demand for parents to be attentive to children whilst attending classes. We know that our children would experience severe anxiety, they would experience severe uneasiness and even irritability with school closed because they no longer have playtime with their friends on the field and so on. And so it creates lessened interaction with their friends. And I just wanted to touch on one point that the minority councillor made and we would admit that with these lockdown measures, and we have seen an increase in perpetrators being brought before the law, because we know domestic violence, child abuse, and so on are on the increase. But we are saying that our monitoring processes are in place. It is, however, very difficult to monitor every home, to monitor every family. And again, this is where, if you know something, say something. We have parents that are at home, families that are at home, and they may now be more inclined and on spot to see what is happening. The Children's Authority is there, the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development there, the Child Protection Unit of the Police Service. We have all been working in excellent collaboration, and we would all admit that we have seen, even throughout this COVID period, a number of perpetrators being brought before the law. So we are saying, if you know a family, that it may probably just be an accusation maybe, but we would step in once we get the information and supervise that child and that home and remove the child from the home if it is so necessary. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, it is important that we ensure parents, children, teachers alike maintain a stable mind throughout this pandemic and should be monitored as long-lasting implications may develop. As such, again, at the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development, we will continue to, with our mandate, to provide the psychological services for parents, for students, for teachers as is necessary. There is also Childline Trinidad and Tobago offering free sessions, and appointments can be made via their website, childlinett.org. And these counseling sessions are for both parents and children who require such service. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, gone are the days when some parents just send their children to school without showing interest in their educational development. And this online learning, despite the challenges that we know are currently being presented, we think that Opportunities are also being provided and flexibility of accessing learning. And we must all come to reality that this would be our new way of life. And in order to mitigate these devastating consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, the government, the Tobago House of Assembly, will continue to play an essential role by ensuring that there is ongoing duty of care to citizens, even in these challenging times, to ensure that we weather the storm together. So, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, as the world continues to watch the virus unfold, as we continue to watch the virus unfold even here in Trinidad and Tobago, it is evident that the pandemic has expanded even beyond the current generation's educational pursuits. The pre-existing disparities continue to hamper the opportunities provided to most in the student population. Persons with disabilities, we heard the Assistant Secretary speak to how they are dealing with those students with disabilities, and that is all in our efforts to ensure that no one is left behind. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, we have placed greater emphasis on meeting the psychosocial needs of our population, but more than that, providing the necessary information to aid in effective family functioning. We do have a number of family types here on the island of Tobago, and it is so for many reasons. So you would see single-parent families, nuclear families, extended families, and as part of our mandate at the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development, we would continue our work to empower these families, to empower our families, and provide the necessary support. So, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, as I wind up, because I did not intend to be very long, I wish to reiterate that COVID-19 has forced us, as a matter of fact, to rethink, to redevelop, to re-strategize, and really to review how our systems operate, and more so, how we do business on the island of Tobago. And I am cognizant, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, that the physical virus may disappear or it may not disappear, but I can assure you that the psychological and the psychosocial effects will be lingering for a very long time as we continue to adjust to this new normal. The point is, we are asking persons to adapt, take it one day at a time, to the new changes in order for us to cope and survive as we go about our daily lives. This new normal, Mr. Presiding Officer, it will allow us, and it is calling on us to be flexible, to be understanding, to be committed, but it is that resilience that will see us through. And I am therefore calling on Tobago to exhibit that rich Tobago spirit, that Tobago togetherness, that Tobago-ness that we are all accustomed to, and support the Tobago House of Assembly, support the Division of Education, support the government of Trinidad and Tobago in our continued efforts to meet the needs of children. I also call on everyone to adopt that each one, reach one initiative and approach. It doesn't matter whether you're doing it for political expediency or not. Do something. We have to ensure that no one is left behind, and the success of all these efforts would require all hands on deck. And so I leave us with a quote that I love from John Davy: education is not preparation for life, but education is life itself. I thank you.
Member for Parliamentary Ransom is Payside, Assemblyman Fari Augustine.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, let me join everyone else in expressing Republic Day greetings to the entire nation and to those who are viewing us online. At our very first motion in this House that treated with the COVID-19 pandemic, I pointed out that we are essentially at war. And I made that comparison with fighting war because research will show that pandemics have killed more people across the globe than any war in Earth's history has done. In fact, whether we go from the Black Death plague to the fatal flu, or even if you want to include HIV/AIDS in the mix, when we look at the numbers of people around the globe that have died at different points in the world's history from pandemics, you will see that more people die from pandemics than from guns and wars. And therefore, we ought to always take treating with pandemics seriously. And I started here because, truth be told, Trinidad and Tobago is a country that has a penchant for making kicks out of serious matters. It's just who we are by nature. It's how we treat with trauma. It's how we treat with things that are wrong or that are hurting us. But I'm afraid that this is one matter that we cannot treat lightly. Because the reality is our economy post-COVID will be decimated. In fact, it's practically there. And God alone knows how we will get over this and how we will manage post-COVID. And even now that we are in this COVID experience, we have to look carefully at every single sector and look at how we ought to adjust. Today we are looking at the education sector. And for me, the major challenge with the motion as tabled is that the motion rightfully recognizes that there are responsibilities both for the people and other stakeholders, and there are responsibilities for the state. But sometimes out of laziness or sometimes out of sheer neglect, the state tends to want to foster upon the people its own responsibilities. And that's where I have a challenge. What really are the responsibilities of the state in all of this? And even as we stand here today and we ask members of the public, private citizens, corporate citizens, to contribute more, to give more, notwithstanding their own difficulties, we must ask ourselves critically if there is an opportunity cost for resources that the state has constantly mismanaged that we could have easily been putting towards our education sector now. Think about all the cost overruns. Think about all the projects that started, that billboards went up, that we started building, never got opened. Think about the millions that we waste away in different vanity projects. Think about those that we have lost through pilfering and never got back. And think about how many devices we could have purchased. Easily, if we are honest, and not just Tobago, Trinidad must be equally honest. If we are honest as a nation and we look at the opportunity cost of corruption, now is a good time to remind ourselves that corruption costs developing societies like ours way too much, and it can become a matter of life and death. And that's where we must start. And so when people are skeptical and cynical about our pleadings, about our beggings, for them to come up and contribute in this time, we have to understand it's not that they're being greedy, it's not that they're being selfish, but it's because they understand the opportunity cost of corruption. And it will be remiss of me to not bring that to bear on this discussion today. The motion acknowledges the involvement of parents and guardians and the challenge that they face during this time. And yes, I will join with everybody else in saying, parents, thank you for being in this fight. And I will join with everyone else in recognizing that parents are challenged like no other time before. And we have to remember that for the generations we have alive now, for most of us, we have never ever experienced a pandemic quite like this. Yes, HIV/AIDS is a global pandemic, but with HIV/AIDS, you generally have to go looking for it to get it. It's a sexually transmitted disease. And so you don't get it by just walking outside, by just hugging somebody, by just shaking a hand. And so the reality for our parents and guardians, and even our pupils and students and teachers, is that this thing is new to all of us. We have never experienced anything like this in our lifetime. And so I was particularly upset, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, when I saw a viral video on social media making the wrongs of a mother who had a skirt hurriedly drawn above her chest, and people were laughing at the fact that she didn't look like she was properly attired and so on. And I would be most upset if it was a teacher that leaked that video, because certainly we must understand the pressures that parents are under. Certainly we must understand that on an average day, parents who are helping students with homework are not doing so with white robes, covering themselves and a coffee mug in their hands. That's the reality. And so we have to be patient with parents. And yes, I accept that. And I can agree with that, and I can implore teachers to be patient with parents. The motion also asks us to acknowledge the fact that the THA wanted to have a blended approach prior to the most recent lockdown that we're on. And that in itself reminds us of how powerless this Tobago House of Assembly as an institution is. And very often you will find me come here and remind this house that most of the things we wish we can do, we cannot do because we really do not have the power so to do. And if the COVID-19 response in Tobago is so good and so great and we are managing so well, then Tobago should really be empowered to step away from what is happening in Trinidad. I myself thought of a blended approach. I myself thought of what it would mean, for example, if we should allow upper school children, that's those from 4th to 6th form, alone to attend school and be spaced out all over the school while the rest of the school is taught online, and teachers come to school and teach their online sessions from at school and the in-school sessions in a very spaced out classroom. I thought about all of that too. But again, we do not have either the power or the willpower to operate laterally, to think and operate laterally, because for some reason our approach has always been, if Trinidad says do it this way, that's the way we are going to do it. Let's just follow suit. But the motion at the end of the day resolves to do two things. And all the preamble to the motion does is just that. Be a preamble to the motion, to the resolution. And the results of the motion is firstly that we support the initiatives of the Division of Education, and we support whatever initiatives that they do have. And yes, we have seen the strides that they have made. We heard previously that we will get some devices from UNICEF. Those haven't arrived as yet. Then we also saw that there's a desire to spend some additional millions to acquire some more devices. We are yet to hear what is the process. We are yet to hear how that will work, how many students or pupils that will cover. And so when the minority leader and the counselor, the minority counselor, spoke about the fact that, we're just throwing these statistics in a scattered way out there. What they are really pointing to is that at this point in the debate, we don't know precisely how many students in Tobago require a device. At least it wasn't said. Some mention was made of some schools. And yes, I must give the Secretary of Education credit for pulling out the stats for schools in my area. In fact, I had all of those stats written down and waiting. And when I heard him, I said, well, this man probably listened to me a little bit too much. So he preempted me. But the point is, across the entire island of Tobago, how many devices are needed at this time? Because if we're asking corporate citizens to assist us, if we're begging them, we should be able to say to them, we need X amount across the entire island. And we should be able to break that down further and say we need X amount for students or pupils and X amount for members of faculty, for members of staff. And so there still isn't a very clear picture of how much is needed, because we haven't quantified in the debate so far what is needed. The second part of the resolution asks that, that we seek that we call on employers and managers and supervisors, both in public and private sector, to demonstrate a sense of tolerance and understanding and so forth. And I remember coming to this house soon after it was announced by the Prime Minister that we're going to have something called pandemic leave. And I kept asking, how will that work? How will that work? Is there a legal instrument for a way to that for that to work? And again, yes, I appreciate that we need to beg corporate Tobago and Trinidad by extension, to be kind, to be aware and cognizant of the times we're living, and to give some little length of rope, allow workers to come in a little late, allow some to work online, rotate staff and so on. But the reality is, even in the public service, where we are doing some rotations now, we still have some parents who are having difficulties. We still have parents who have exhausted all their regular leave. We still have parents who are still struggling to cope. And for us, we must ask ourselves, is the state better prepared for treating with this pandemic than the private sector? Look around our divisions. Our divisions and departments, do they have facilities for holding children there? So that if workers still have to work and so on, and this goes beyond the pandemic. This hits at the heart of a society that for many, many years have refused to really progress with the times, have refused to embrace technology. And this should be seen as an opportunity for us to force the public sector, firstly, as an example, to embrace technology and to become more technologically advanced in the way it does business. We should, at this point, have had a society that could have easily moved virtually, because we would have already had a significant part of our operations online, on soft copy. And if it is, we are still at a stage where you have to pull a drawer and look for an old book somewhere about, or a tattered manila file somewhere to find documents. If we are still at that state as a society, this pandemic shows our weakness. Not just those in the private sector. It also shows our weakness as the state. And even as we are begging teachers, I know it's ironic and borderline hypocritical, we are begging teachers and guardians and parents and students and pupils, to try your best, do your best and so on. But this is the same house. At one point we said we're going to do our sitting online virtually. We all got devices, we did one test run, and then we abandoned the idea. We who abandoned the idea of doing it virtually, here today begging people to be patient and to try the best. That's quite ironic. So clearly, we who are here at this level of the state, of the public service, have not demonstrated sufficiently the same kind of latitude and lateral thinking and lateral approaches that we are trying to employ from this society, that we're trying to require this society to do. And I also want to point out that we do have a singular lawmaking legislature in this country, and that's the National Parliament. And the National Parliament can, through the use of laws and regulations, actually make it easier to treat with some of these issues that we are begging people to be tolerant about. When we talk about the use of devices and how much is unavailable, the minority leader pointed out the laptop program that started in 2010. And as a former teacher, I'll be the first to tell you that that program was flawed. I'll be the first to tell you that that program was fraught with issues. But I will also be the first to tell you that what should have happened is that we should have upgraded that program to one that was better than it was. Because that 2010 program, it wasn't sustainable as it was, and it wasn't properly thought out. The devices weren't always the best. The maintenance was problematic. But sometimes as a country, and I always say that's one of the biggest flaws in Trinidad and Tobago and governance. There is this principle that once I come into power, it does not matter how good or partially good something was that was presented by a previous regime. It is my duty to wipe the slate clean and to ignore it all. And that's what's happened. When what we should have had by this time, by 2020, Trinidad and Tobago should have been a country that had e-textbooks for all subjects. Trinidad and Tobago should have been a country where students could have gone to schools with tablets as opposed to paper books. And there's a plethora of research about the weightiness of the book bags of our children that we have been ignoring, because everybody thinks that good education means that your child's book bag must be weighing the back down to the ground, and somehow, because Dr. Williams said that, the future is in the book bag, the heavier the book bag is, the brighter the future. The world knows that that is not true. So why it is we are not yet at the place where all our textbooks are e-books and readily available via e-format? Why are we not yet at the place whereby we have a pandemic, but it is easy for us to transition into it? And yes, there are many countries in the world struggling like we are. But at which point are we going to start comparing ourselves with the best in the world and aspire to be the best in the world? At which point are we going to stop saying, well, it have these countries in the Caribbean struggling too, and them over there saying doing so well, so we okay too? At what point are we going to look at the best in the world and say, that's where I need to be? And that point should not be missed on us. And while that laptop program, some claim, did not have significant impact on student performance, we see today that we ought to have a knowledge-driven society. And when they are doing their assessment for human development now, and they're looking at education as one of the factors on the HDI, they are actually looking at internet penetration as well, as one of the elements of education. Because where there is good internet penetration, you also have access to knowledge. And I'll talk about that in a short while. To the teachers in the system, yes, I too want to ask of you to be patient and to try your best. And I wish to share an anecdote with you, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer. The Saturday evening before school reopened, a group of teachers were using my constituency office in Speyside. They were using the internet service and they were printing stuff, organizing themselves. As a team, they were there and they were organizing their scheme of work and so forth. And I dropped in to drop off some sweetbread for them. And one of the teachers said to me, she said, Farley, I don't I don't know if I can make this thing, My eyes ain't so good. I was supposed to do surgery. In one eye, I have 90-something%. I can't remember the figure. And next eye, 80-something%. The surgery got put off because of COVID. And I tell my principal, but he's still pressuring me to try to get all of this done. And to be honest, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I left there and I said, maybe she's just making up excuses. Maybe she don't really want to do the work. Only to find out on the first Friday that same teacher ended up fainting. And when they rushed her to the hospital, she had a slight attack of stroke. And in that moment, I pinched myself and said, oh gosh, Farley, you were so insensitive in your thoughts about the teacher's complaint. Because in my mind, yeah, they could do more. Push yourself. We're complaining about. You're home whole time. You're getting paid. Do more. But yes, teachers, you have to take good care of yourself. And it's perhaps one of the only thing from the presentation prior to mine that I will agree with, that teachers need self-care. Because we don't want to lose you in the midst of this pandemic. We don't want you to fail in this pandemic because you are critical to all of us. I also saw an article run by Guardian Media where another Tobago teacher was saying, teachers, and I'm quoting Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, and this teacher is saying, teachers are being placed under immense pressure in a system designed to fail. Close quotation. Is a teacher said that? And I could tell you it's a teacher from one of our prestigious schools that said that. And it's actually one of our high-performing teachers. I mean, a teacher who gets good results every time that also said that. So it's not just a lazy teacher. It's not a teacher who just trying to not do the work that said that. It's a good teacher who said that. And so while we are begging our teachers to be patient and to do their best, we also have to remember that as a state, we have a responsibility to them. And the question is, are we meeting our responsibilities to them? Are we meeting our responsibilities to these teachers? Many of whom have been asking for the same proper internet in the schools all the time. Long before COVID, they were asking for proper internet. Long before COVID, they were asking for proper laptops and tablets that actually work and where the hinges not falling out. Long before COVID. The fact that we only now trying to scramble during COVID says that we really were not serious about integrating technology into the classroom. We were never serious about this. I heard the move of the motion speak to the issue of internet connectivity, and I want to be less kind than him to our utility companies. Because, you see, Mr. President, I represent perhaps the most rural district on the island. And perhaps more than anyone else in this room, I experience the madness that happens with our utility companies and the kind of services that they provide. We look at Digicel. Almost on a daily basis, the system going down. Almost every day.
Member, you have 10 minutes of your original speak time remaining.
Thank you. Almost every day, the internet service goes down. Almost every day. And I cannot understand how an internet service provider that charges perhaps higher rates than the others will not be efficient. And I don't think we need to be begging Digicel. I think it was the founder of your own party who at the time said that they should take Telco and throw it in the Gulf of Paria. Maybe we should take Digicel and throw it in the Bocas. Because they're not doing a good job. They're doing a horrible job. TSTT must be included. And let us be real. These internet service providers offered next to nothing during the COVID pandemic. When people were on lockdown, Digicel was still sending your text messages left, right, and center, threatening to cut off your internet if you did not come and pay. Still sending it to you and sending text messages to remind you that you could pay online even if you can't come to a physical store. And so I don't think we should be playing nice with Digicel and TSTT. What is the Telecommunications Authority doing in Trinidad and Tobago? They have a responsibility to ensure that these service providers provide quality service, and they are not. In 2020, when I got lunch, I had to cock up internet box by a window trying to pick up internet. In 2020, we're still at that point. In 2020, we still have massive black zones. Some areas that you go, your TSTT phone cannot pick up any signal. You can't make a call. There are times I'm trying to make a phone call and the call is just not connecting at all, not even ringing out. And that is unacceptable. And COVID should not have brought us to the realization that these companies have been giving us substandard services. That's a reality. And as for Tiantech, who lives up to the nursery rhyme, winky, blinky, and nod. There isn't a day that electricity doesn't cut off at some point where I live. And I don't think I live behind God, but there are places in the world way more remote than Speyside, and that has good quality internet access and electricity. This is an energy producing nation. And for an energy producing nation, we have our own electrical company, public electrical company, playing winky, blinky, and nod with our electricity. That's unfair. And think of you may not understand, but every time the internet cuts off for a teacher that lives in areas like my area, it means they have to restart their Zoom classes because the internet would have crashed. They have to restart. They have to try to get the students back on. They have to hope the students and say, well, okay, Miss or Sir gone, I gone too. And then when it cuts off for the students, the teacher doesn't know if the student was just being rude and just left the class, or if the student is having challenges. Our utility companies are failing us during this period, and they must be taken to task for failing us. And we shouldn't try to sugarcoat it and hope that they do better, and we hope that they improve internet access in certain areas. Look how long did you sell in Tobago? Look at how long TSTT has been with us on this island of Tobago, and we're still struggling for quality service. It's unacceptable to say the least. And the minority leader brought a perfect example from Jamaica, where educational sites are zero rated, where you don't need internet access, meaning you don't have to have paid internet access to access certain sites. So if you have data on your phone and you need to get onto the Ministry of Education website, or you need to go onto an academic journal or UA website, it doesn't take out any charge from your data. And what? We have companies here who are doing a horrible job at providing services. And I say that without any apology. The digital divide is real, therefore, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer. And residents in rural communities are generally greater affected, more disproportionately affected than other areas. And that has to be measured. And we have to look at that closely. Tobago is a small population. And while the numbers may look small, 10 from some villages is actually a lot when you look at the larger population. As in 10 children without access is a lot when you look at the smallness or the size of some of those populations. We must do more than just ask for support. That's the point. We must do more than just come here and say to teachers and parents and corporate citizens and private people, we need your support. We need you to give some more. We must do more than that. And this pandemic highlights the fact that as a state, as a country, that is one of the wealthiest countries in the Caribbean region, as a country that has had its blessings upon blessings, so much so that its cup kept overflowing and we were drinking from the saucer, that we have not done enough. And yes, all of that blame doesn't rest with who is at the executive in Tobago now, or who is at the executive in Trinidad now. Because I can tell you, if we have that life support money now, we could buy plenty good devices too. But the point is, there is an opportunity cost to corruption. there is an opportunity cost to mismanagement. There is an opportunity cost to time wasting. There is an opportunity cost to when we do not progress fast enough. And I want to leave this house with a simple example. I know of a school right here in Tobago who at one time purchased a large set of Amazon Kindles, beautiful white Kindles. And when those Kindles got to the school, I don't know if it is people got bazodi, but the Kindles got locked up in a room. One teacher managed the process, and that one teacher felt like those Kindles should not be used just so. The children going to mash them up. They go take them outside. They go do all kind of thing with them. The same thing, reasons, foolish reasons people give for why we shouldn't give devices to children and why students shouldn't come to school with devices, as if we're living in 1980. But the long and short of the story is, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, that school arrived at a particular year when they remembered, wait, we had some Kindles. But when they went and checked the Kindles, what was the funny part of it? All of those Kindles were the older Kindles with the physical buttons. And Amazon had gone light years beyond those Kindles. Those Kindles they had were all black and white. And Amazon now had colored Kindles and so on. In other words, I want the entire of Tobago to take a lesson from that story, which is, if we do not reform and follow the natural progression of the world, we will be left behind. And by the time we are ready, or by the time a crisis comes, we will be left scrambling. We cannot in 2020, after this, still be thinking that children should not come to school with their cell phones, their smartphones, or their devices, or that schools shouldn't have internet access for students because somehow if they have internet access, all they got to do is watch porn. Foolishness. If we are to be an innovative society, we have to reinvent ourselves all the time and quickly. And 1980 rules cannot work for 1920. And so, yes, we are all in this together. Yes, we beg parents and teachers and civil society and everybody to come on board and to try their best. But I wish to say to this house and to the executive that your responsibility cannot become the responsibility of any other stakeholder in the education sector. What you are supposed to do is that you should have already been the one providing devices long ago. That we should have long ago had e-books. That we should have long ago dealt with the criminal textbook people. That textbook crew are criminals writing books, most of which have wrong information and crappy information. All of that should have been dealt with a long time ago. And those are the responsibilities of the state, not the responsibilities of those that we come here to beg today. Thank you.
Member for Blackrock Wim Spring Garden and Secretary of Education, Innovation and Energy, Assemblyman Kelvin Charles.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer. You know, I had an aunt, so it tells you that she has passed on. And one of her favorite comments was that mouth make to talk. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, he that is without sin, let him cast the first stone. I begin my rebuttal by referring to some of the comments made by the minority leader, who has demonstrated over the last couple of years his unpreparedness for office, because with monotonous regularity, he makes his contributions, which invariably are devoid of substance, and then leaves. He has done it again. Came in late, and he has left. And what sometimes is irritating is his attempt to lecture to some of us in this house. Imagine he finds fault with the structure of the motion and speaks of respect for each person's time. If anyone in this house that has disrespected the time of those of us sitting here, it is the minority leader. And his presentations are usually characterized by boring repetitions. In fact, it is painful to sit and listen to his presentations. He attempts to make an issue of school, not recognizing that we are virtual. And one can talk about a virtual classroom and so a virtual school. So making devices available to schools are in fact making devices in the context of a virtual school or a virtual classroom. I take this opportunity to say to him that words can either be denotative or connotative, and I shall be happy to provide him with an elaboration should he require it. As usual, he likes to talk about set the date. You know, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, the last opposition leader that called for the date, when the date came, to use local parlance, she turned stupid. And after the results, she couldn't even breathe. I was wondering if there was a George Floyd situation in Trinidad and Tobago. We, as I indicated, moved as swiftly as we could. The truth be told, no one expected that come September we would go virtual. Indeed, we were planning for, as I indicated in my presentation, a mixture of online teaching as well as in-class teaching. And I did outline, and I wouldn't go back over it, the approaches we were taking. And for anyone to suggest that because COVID came upon us in March means that we had 6 months, such a person is being extremely disingenuous, because we all recognized the challenge and we all knew that it was new to all of us. And the reason why I placed it in a global perspective is to underline and underscore the fact that countries that are more advanced than we are were in the same trouble as we are. And you know, sometimes one wonders, because the minority leader was suggesting, in the face of science and in the face of precautions that we were advised to take based on health, suggesting that some students should go out to school with some teachers in an attempt to be flexible. No wonder I read online earlier today that he held a party for some of his friends in Roxborough, and many of whom were arrested. I don't know, I'm quoted from online, but it underscores the fact that some of us are predisposed to break the law. And I thought when my colleague, the distinguished counselor, Assistant Secretary for Health, spoke, she would have given him some personal advice, because I know they are friends. But I listened attentively and I didn't get. Apparently she will tell him off air or offline. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, as I indicated, this thing took a lot of planning. And in fact, for those who are attempting to nitpick, because indeed I don't know if they expected that it was a budget presentation and therefore one had unlimited time. But in the context of the limited time, I presented a concise overview of the actions and activities that we did undertake as a division. And therefore, in respect of some of the statistics that I outlined, I gave passing reference to some of the statistics. Had I given all the statistics, we would have been here for at least 3 hours in my presentation. And then some persons nitpick. And you know, we have come here, and as much as we are accused of a particular kind of approach since we took office, there is a saying about the beam and the mote from your eyes, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer. I think that applies to members of the minority. Because apparently it's they alone who speak to persons in the community, and they alone who get feedback. My presentation earlier reflected the assessments of principals who are managing their schools. And in that management process, are in fact managing their staffs. We have been for some time in the conduct of our business of education, been allowing our principals, as what we say, school-based management, to engage in school-based management, which means, in essence, that the principal in any school is essentially the chief executive officer, and therefore is empowered to use, to organize, to mobilize the resources available to him or her to make decisions and to solve problems that are present in their schools. And quite frankly, our principals have risen to the occasion. And indeed, many of them have been quite flexible in their organization. I know for a fact that in some schools, because you do have children from one family in different classes, the timetable has been so structured to reflect that situation or that reality. Additionally, I am aware of at least 2 schools that have organized their teaching and learning situation in such a way they're online, so that it's done for some classes after normal school hours. So it is in fact happening. But you see, we tend to, as part of our survey, if I were to call it that, hook on to some of those issues that allow us to be able to say something. The feedback that I have been getting, and as I indicated, that some parents continue to have some difficulty. And indeed, we understand that, and we are moving to treat with that. More particularly, our student support services have been engaged in meeting some of these parents and have been working with them to alleviate their problems. As a matter of fact, I can say to this Honorable House that I gave instructions to hire at least 9 additional persons to buttress the work of the Student Support Services section or unit in the division, because I understood that the situation was one that would give rise to additional challenges. And that is in train as we speak. Collaboration has always been the feature of this administration, because we have said on more than one occasion that the jurisdictional walls of Jericho must come crashing down, and that different divisions must collaborate with other divisions in dispensing services to our population, because that's what we are about. And therefore, I caution those who use this opportunity to engage in what I call extemporaneous prevarications. You know, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, it would be negligent if I didn't respond to one of the points raised by the member for Palliative Care, Charlottesville, Lands for Me, Speyside, when he spoke about corruption as if to taint this administration with that brush. We have done a marvelous job, and I say that without fear of contradiction, in husbanding our resources. You just have to look around and see the quality and quantity of work done with less resources. May I remind this House that when we came to office in 2017, with the stroke of a pen, this assembly had to work with $500 million less. Maybe they forget that, or maybe they have seen things looking so well that they thought it was milk and honey. And we had to cut and contrive. The next year, it was even worse, less funding. As a matter of fact, in 2018, we were allocated the same level of funding as in 2012. Yes, Mr. Minority Leader, same level of funding. And more importantly, in your hat as union leader, I take this opportunity to remind you that we had to find, even with less resources, $200 million more than we had to find in 2012 just for the payment of emoluments. And we did it. It was interesting to hear the members speak about forcing the public sector to come to the table, meaning to come to terms with the fact that we must go digital. It was an interesting comment, because the truth be told, he lives in Tobago. And he knows the challenge that anybody, any leadership, any administration would have. Because he knows that there's an issue with respect to our levels of productivity. In fact, in 2018, we embarked on a project, a Teachers Professional Center at Madden House, and the intent really was to use technology and ensure that our teachers were provided with a platform, an opportunity, a space where virtually they could tune in, they could access best practices, lessons, model lessons, and so on. And it was like pulling teeth to get some of our teachers to respond. In fact, even, and I'm not knocking teachers, I'm talking reality. And even when the pandemic did set in, it was also a challenge to get teachers to engage in online teaching, but more particularly in the production of lessons and videos and have them aired. But I can say to the Honorable House that sometimes, you see, it takes a trigger, and perhaps the pandemic is the trigger. And indeed, calls have been made, and we are responding to those calls. And the center at Madden House is due for an upgrade, and that will become a hub for virtual teaching and learning alongside the website that we have relaunched in March of this year. I also want us to be careful, and that is why I started by saying, you know, be careful of the stones that you pelt. and he who is without sin cast the first stone. Those of us who like on the minority side to talk about hypocrisy and try to give the impression that we are holier than thou. At the height of the lockdown, there were members on that side who were seen hugging up persons without mask and in the absence of physical distancing, comfortably, in defiance of science, and paying absolutely very little regard for the prohibitions as outlined in our health protocols. We are humans, and sometimes we make mistakes, and let's recognize that. But we need to be careful when we attempt to use very, very strong language as we seek to gain mileage. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, before I outline some additional statistics for the minority leader, because he's interested in those, it seems, although we did hear from Councillor Nadine Phillips that she, and of course she did it proudly, made some donations of devices to parents and children in the East. What was interesting is that she quoted the actual number. On the other hand, I am accused of being general in some of my information, and yet the minority leader stood up and said that he has given help or support by way of devices to students and parents in Roxborough. But up to now, we don't know whether it's 1, whether it's 2, whether it's 3, or whether it's 4. For that matter, it may be none at all. But for the fact that I will continue to do what I have done, consistent with the point raised by his colleague, the member on his left, that is all hands must work productively, I would have found the time to walk Roxborough and find out who are the recipients of those devices from the minority leader. But I leave that to his conscience and his God. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, we at the division embarked on a project to implement in the first instance an online learning platform for 3,500 students. These were students that were due to face exams, SCA, CSEC, and CAPE. That platform is a Moodle platform, and that is one that is extremely rigid in the sense that it's difficult for you to, as it were, breach it. But in addition to that, we engaged TITL to assist in that exercise, and TITL, in recommending Moodle, which we accepted, and the proposed implementation method, whether it would have been self-hosted or vendor-hosted, but we have a vendor hosting it. They also provided training for users of that platform, as well as to assist in setting up after support team or technical help to persons in the division as we seek to bring persons up to be familiar with the system. And in fact, we have trained a number of persons, in excess of 300 persons on this particular platform in content creation and the like. And training began in June the 3rd, as early as June the 3rd. Yeah, even before we were told that we had to reopen in a virtual setting. And continued creation of content is on the way, and the team will continue to train and support persons recommended by the division, because the intention is that at the end of the day, the Moodle platform will be one of the major ones that we would use because of its security features, as well as the features it possesses for interactive teaching. Additionally, on March the 16th, we know all educational institutions were closed. And in the week of the 16th to the 20th of March, at the level of the Tobago Hospitality and Tourism Institute, they were getting ready. And their classes resumed online in 1 week, Monday the 23rd of March, and have since remained online. So much so that they have received requests from students attending the Trinidad and Tobago Hospitality Institute located in Trinidad that has since closed its doors. And the unit is engaging in preparing to host those students consistent with the courses that they run.
Member, you have 10 minutes of speaking time remaining.
Thank you. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, when I say that we have, on an average, 80 to 90% of students engaged, this is information coming from the principals of our schools. And that is throughout the island of Tobago. As a matter of fact, in one area, in terms of the east, from Charlottesville, and that includes Scarborough, Methodist, and Pentecostal, but it also takes in Mount St. George, Methodist, Goodwood, Pembroke, Belgarden, Roxborough, Ebenezer, Delaford, AC, Delaford, RC, Speyside, Charlottesville, the two schools there. The total percentage of students engaged online is 89.4%. And the total percentage of students engaged through packages is 10.65. Had I the time, I would have given you school by school and class by class, because I do have it. In another from Mason Hall, Wim, Lansfome, Palativer, St. Patrick's, School for the Deaf, Bonaccord, Devines Road Government, St. Andrews Anglican Mariah Government, we're talking approximately, on an average, 90% online engagement. Boko, Plymouth, Happy Haven, Lambeau Anglican, Table Peace Government, Blackrock Government, Bethesda Government, Signal Hill Government, Golden Lane Government, Montgomery, about the same thing, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer. I even have the classes and the name of the teachers and all of that. That is the level of detail that we have gone to, and we continue to determine the various devices that are in use, because we do understand that in some instances, cell phones are being used And we want to get to the bottom of that so that at an appropriate time, we can engage them with the devices that we are procuring, as well as the devices that are being given by well-intentioned, benevolent citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. And you know, it was sad listening to some of the deprecatory remarks in respect of persons who are voluntarily, responding to our appeal to assist. Because as I did indicate, it's a whole of island approach. We are known, and we have been known, and in some instances we may have departed from it, to be a very close-knitted society, one in which we were our brothers' keepers. And all we are doing really is calling on that inner nature that we have, that latent predisposition to assist, to once again come to the fore in these circumstances, and to hear those on the minority side talk about begging in such deprecating terms. It was indeed quite sickening to listen to that. I take this opportunity to advise this House that come the 5th of October, we will once again commence our school feeding program. And we will be, as usual, feeding all of our children that have been registered. We are engaged in putting together the final touches of the plan, because arguably the logistics will be different, because when those lunches would have been taken to a school, it's not going to happen exactly like that. What we are seeking to do is to determine and to get certain spaces in communities as distribution points, but more importantly, because in some instances we have students, let's say from Charlottesville, who are not only going to Charlottesville-based schools, but will be going to other schools. It is important that we get the data that tells us that there is this number of students living in Charlottesville who would be or would have been attending schools, whether it's the secondary schools or whether it is other primary schools, so that once we get into Charlottesville, then we go there to feed everyone. So that represents, in a real sense, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, some of the plans that we have undertaken to ensure that we meet the challenges presented by this unprecedented situation. And I take this opportunity to congratulate my colleagues, the Assistant Secretary in the division, as well as Counselor in the Division of Health, who in their own contributions would have also provided the complementary approaches that have been taken to ensure that the teaching and learning continues. But I know I'm winding down, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, but I would be negligent if I didn't say this. And you'll permit me if I make reference or if I use the vernacular. I know what is sticking in their craw, The fact that notwithstanding the challenges, we have seen the best results both at the CSEC and CAPE level. They would have been happy to hear that we haven't done well. They can't deal with that. And let me just say, with your permission, two things. In respect of our CSEC students, 271 of them received full certificates in 2019. In 2020, 394. In respect of CAPE, Unit 1 and Unit 1, subject entries, grades 1 and 2. I'm leaving it there. There was 517 in 2019, and in 2020, 646. That is sticking in the craw. So, so Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, even as we advance the process for our students, I take this opportunity to commend the teachers and principals, as well as all stakeholders generally, including the PTA, for the role they have played so far, as I urge them to continue. Because this is not about Kelvin Charles. It is not about this Secretary of Education. It is really about how we organize to make sure that our students get the education they deserve. Because at the end of the day, it is they who will have to provide the leadership for this island. Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, I thank you.
Members, the question put is as follows. Whereas the coronavirus, COVID-19, has impacted the traditional delivery of education globally, and whereas the blended approach that involves face-to-face and online teaching is not practical at this time in Trinidad and Tobago, and whereas in Trinidad and Tobago, schools cannot physically reopen for the first school term, September 1st to December 17th, 2020, thereby necessitating online instructions as well as the use of packaged materials. And whereas there is a great need for the involvement of parents and guardians in ensuring that students are able to effectively continue receiving instructions during this new normal, be it resolved that this House supports the initiatives of the Division of Education, Innovation and Energy to provide improved instructional, technical, psychological and logistical support for students, teachers and parents. And be it further resolved that this House calls on employers, managers and supervisors in both the public and private sectors to demonstrate a sense of tolerance, understanding and commitment towards the parents of students who may be in their employ. And be it further resolved that this House implores businesses, civil society organizations, private citizens and all other stakeholders to contribute to the provision of appropriate digital devices for use in our schools, as well as to offer support generally in ensuring that we meet the needs of our students at this time. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All against, nay. The ayes have it. The motion is carried.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer. I beg to move that this House now stand adjourned to a date to be fixed.
Members, the question is that this House now stands adjourned to a date to be fixed. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed say nay. The ayes have it. This House now stands adjourned.